Good, well, thank you very much indeed for that warm welcome. And looking at your stand there, Conservatives for Liberty, it sounds like I'm going to be amongst friends this evening. And you're absolutely right, I definitely describe myself as a firm and enthusiastic Thatcherite, as I hope most of the parliamentary party these days. And so I was reading the brief description of what your organisation campaigns for, and I must say I found myself in agreement with pretty much everything I read. And the first word I saw in the description was the word responsibility, personal responsibility, as opposed to being told what to do by the state. And personal responsibility is a concept that I believe in very, very profoundly. And I think the last, 5,000 years of human history teach us that when you give people personal responsibility, rather than have some organisation like a government trying to coerce them, you end up firstly with a population that is happier, and secondly, a population where you have better outcomes. And let me just think of, or mention one or two examples which I think illustrate this case. And one that springs to mind most obviously is prohibition in America in the 1920s, when the government tried to essentially ban the production and consumption of alcohol. And that, as we'll know, had catastrophic effects. First of all, people just ignored the law and drank anyway. And secondly, it acted as a sort of breeding ground for what became the Chicago mob, who made money by illicitly brewing and transporting alcohol, or moonshine as they called it. So it had a completely counterproductive effect. It didn't achieve its objective, and it created a massive criminal fraternity, and it stopped the population drinking as they saw fit. So I think there's an example of where the government trying to ban something and over-regulate was a complete disaster. But even today in the UK, we see quite a few examples of this concept of personal responsibility not being properly applied. And I think one of the most obvious areas is the welfare state. Now, the welfare state was constructed with very laudable objectives in mind, to try and prevent poverty and help people who needed helping. And if you read the original Beveridge report, I think published from memory in about 1942, it was very clear that with rights came responsibilities. But somehow, over the last 40 or 50 years, that concept has been eroded. And I encounter in my surgeries as a constituency member of Parliament some people who see welfare as a right or as an entitlement, and they don't really have any sense of the accompanying responsibilities. And when I'm feeling slightly brave, and I can do this now, I've got a 17,000 majority rather than a very marginal seat which I contested 5 years ago. I feel brave enough to sometimes say to people who come to my surgery and say, for example, with like a nicer council house or something, if I'm feeling brave enough, I say, well, Croydon has 10,000 people on the waiting list. Have you considered, getting either working more hours or trying to find employment rather than relying on welfare, and rather than expecting the state to provide for you, do it yourself. And I say that whenever I can muster the courage to say it to someone's face, and I do fairly often. And what's interesting is that in some cases, to my astonishment, I get, and I've got a sort of collection of these, I get occasionally emails or letters back, not saying sort of how dare you tell me to go and get a job, but actually saying I thought about what you said, and I did go and get a job. And in fact, in one case, a lady wrote back to me saying I've set up a business, I set up a nail bar, and thank you very much for sort of pointing out that there was an alternative to simply relying on state handouts. And I think that is an example of where the state simply providing without requiring any responsibility in return doesn't really work. And actually it's bad for society because we end up paying enormous bills. Welfare today consumes, or working age welfare, costs about £100 billion a year. Along with pensions, it's the biggest line item in the national budget, similar to the NHS as well, those three things. But it's also very bad for the people in receipt of it, because rather than taking responsibility for working and improving their own lives, they simply look to the state. And I think it's very sort of depressing and very enervating when that happens. And I think some of the measures the government has put in place recently, like the welfare cap, £20,000 a year outside London, and now requiring people to go through the work programme, so they've got to, long-term benefit claimants have to go through a sort of job search process in order to keep claiming benefits. I think that's really helped. And when we introduced those things, the Labour Party said, it's going to cause poverty, people are going to be homeless, it's going to be a catastrophe. But what's actually happened, I think in Croydon, the Labour Council said there are going to be 500 people made homeless by the welfare cap when it was introduced a couple of years ago. And in fact, I think pretty much no one got made homeless, and in fact, those people ended up just working more hours or moving into work. And that's nationally, I think about 70,000 people who were getting more than the benefits cap and benefits have now gone into full-time work. So, as ever, as Margaret Thatcher said, the facts of life turn out to be conservative. So there's responsibility. And I think a second area where liberty is so important is in the field of innovation. And I think there's a very interesting contrast between the way the European Union approached this and the way the United States of America approached this. And broadly speaking, I'm generalising, but broadly speaking, the difference is that in the European Union, when somebody comes up with an idea of a product, whatever it might be, generally speaking, there's the onus is on the producer of that product to prove to the regulator that it's safe. Whereas in the USA, it's the other way around. It's considered to be safe until someone proves that it isn't. And that means that innovation in the UK is much more healthy than it is here. And you take an example like vaping, these, I don't smoke, but these sort of artificial cigarettes. They're a fantastically good idea because it stops people inhaling massively carcinogenic tobacco fumes. And if anyone here smokes, I'm sorry for pointing out that you're killing yourself. But it's your choice. You can do that if you want. So vaping is a pretty good thing. It's definitely good for your health. And yet regulators are beginning to try and clamp down on it for some ridiculous reason. And I have similar feelings about GM crops, which, as far as I can tell, I'm a scientist by academic background, a physicist, not a biochemist, but as far as I can tell, GM crops will massively increase crop yields, yet the European Union has decided they're a bad idea without any real, as far as I can tell, real evidence base. They've just been sort of whipped into a hysterical frenzy by the Green lobby. So there's another example of the European Union stifling innovation where in the USA they've pretty much embraced it. So I think liberty and freedom are the bedfellows, are the enable innovation. Without that liberty, I think innovation is very, very difficult. And most great innovations were created by sort of slightly eccentric, often loners working outside of the state structure. And I think giving people the liberty to do that and to think creatively is so important. So I think that's the second reason why your agenda is so important. And I think there's a third form of liberty that I believe in very profoundly, and that is to do with ownership. Of course, you would have thought we'd won the argument that actually the state owning lots of things is a bad idea, but just this afternoon, John MacDonald brandished Chairman Mao's little red book and started quoting from it to the Chancellor, beyond parody. And in fact, the Chancellor, who came to the 1922 committee next door a few minutes ago, said he's actually hung on to it because MacDonald sort of threw it across the dispatch box. And George said he's debating whether or not to auction it off to raise funds for the Conservative Party. It would be ironic if we use Chairman Mao's red book to raise a lot of money for the Conservative Party. That would be one of politics' more delicious ironies. So you would have thought this argument about ownership had been won. And of course we saw in the 1980s all of these state-owned industries that were often massively loss-making, like British Airways and British Telecom, which used to be state-owned companies making massive losses by the end of the 80s in private ownership, making a profit and paying taxes rather than requiring public subsidy. So you would have thought those arguments had been won, but actually in the area of housing, those arguments have not been won. And the Housing and Planning Bill is currently going through Parliament, and I've got the very dubious pleasure of serving on the Bill Committee scrutinising that. I say the dubious pleasure because we started this, it's one of my first bills, I thought the Finance Bill, it's my second Bill Committee. The first line of this Bill Committee is about 8 words long, and the Labour MP for Durham, who is, I think, Parliament's most boring MP, which by the way is quite a high hurdle to jump, managed to talk for an hour and a half on a single sentence, so at which point I've begun to regret volunteering to this Bill Committee. But anyway, this bill, Conservative-sponsored bill, obviously, is designed to promote home ownership, people owning their own homes, living in their own homes, and yet the Labour Party seem to disagree with that concept and think socially provided housing, so by the council or a housing association, is preferable. I strongly disagree with that. I think people owning their own home is a fundamentally socially good thing. It gives them a stake in society, it gives them control over their own destiny, and it means they can enjoy the fruits of economic development as house prices, generally speaking, tend to go up over time. Whereas by contrast, in the sort of social rented sector, they are dependent on some third-party landlord. They're at the whim of that landlord, and they don't participate economically if the value of that housing unit goes up. And if the house is badly built, flat is badly maintained, there's sort of nothing they can do about it, really. So for all of those reasons, I believe very profoundly in home ownership. I think that is the next sort of big political battle to try and get home ownership levels back up. And if you look at today's autumn statement, a lot of the things in there are to do with promoting home ownership, and all the money, I think it's £4 billion to sort of encourage developers to build more. All of those affordable houses are to own rather than to rent. And I know it's George Osborne's priority to get home ownership levels back up, because they peaked at 70% about 8 years ago, and they've been drifting down. It's now down to 63%. And in my view, owning your own home is a fundamental part of personal responsibility and personal liberty. And the reason I volunteered for this bill committee was to try and push forward that concept. And the fourth and final point I'd like to make is a much broader one. One of the most, I think, influential books I've ever read, I'm sure many people here have read it too, is a book by Hayek, the Austrian by descent, but then at Chicago University, called The Road to Serfdom, which makes the case very, very powerfully that excessive state control of the economy, or excessive state control or interference in people's everyday lives is a road that eventually leads to a total loss of personal freedom, because the only way the state can ultimately impose their will is by taking more and more freedom away from you. And if you haven't read it, you definitely should, because this book makes the case for freedom and responsibility and liberty in the most powerful possible way. And I think it makes the philosophical, I've made a few practical points, but this book makes the philosophical points behind the agenda that I know this organisation is advancing. So all I can say is that we've now got a Conservative majority government, just. We are pushing forward, I believe, the sort of agenda that I've described. To the extent the government sometimes veers off track. There is one advantage, by the way, of only having a majority of 12, and that is that the government is unusually attentive when backbenchers raise concerns. So if they had a majority of 100, and someone like me raised an issue, they'd just ignore it. With a majority of 12, they know that they can only afford for 6 people to get upset before they lose a vote. So they do listen to backbenchers in a way that perhaps governments in the past haven't. So there are lots of Conservative backbenchers who believe in these principles very strongly. And what I can say is that I and others, you're going to hear from some this evening, will energetically and relentlessly push forward the case for freedom and liberty. And it's the reason I'm here in Parliament. And look, thank you for the support you give to those extremely important causes.